Old Sacramento is a city built on top of itself. This is not a metaphor. The original ground level of the city that grew up at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers during and after the gold rush of 1849 sits between 8 and 12 feet below the current street grade, accessible today through the basements of buildings that visitors reach from street level without knowing they are descending through stairwells that feel like they lead down when they are in fact leading to where the city used to be. The raising happened between the 1860s and the 1880s, driven by the Sacramento River, which flooded the city with a regularity and thoroughness that made building at original grade an exercise in recurring catastrophe. The Great Flood of January 1862 put most of Sacramento under 10 feet of water for weeks, and the city's response, once the water receded, was to raise itself, to bring in fill, to build new street grades on top of the old ones, to jack existing buildings up on their foundations and construct new lower levels beneath them, and to connect the new street level to the old one through an evolving network of underground passages that served practical purposes: access to old utility infrastructure, storage, movement between buildings, and that accumulated, over the decades of the city's construction, a geography of their own that the official street-level city sat above, without fully accounting for. The Central Pacific Railroad arrived in Sacramento in the 1860s and made the city the western terminus of the transcontinental line that would be completed at Promontory Summit, Utah, in 1869. The railroad's presence in Sacramento was not merely economic. It was physical in the most literal sense. The railroad required land for its yards and depots and maintenance facilities. It required changes to the city's grade and drainage infrastructure in the areas adjacent to its operations. And it required a degree of institutional authority over the built environment near its facilities that the Central Pacific, under the direction of the Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, exercised with the confidence of an organization that had essentially built the political economy of California and felt entitled to conduct itself accordingly. When the railroad made decisions about what would and would not be accessible in the portions of Sacramento it controlled, or adjacent to the areas it controlled, those decisions had the weight of institutions that answered to very few authorities above them. A plumber named Ira Flood. The name is almost too perfect, and is therefore the first thing a reader familiar with the genre will suspect, which is reasonable, and which will be addressed before this account proceeds much further. Appears in the Sacramento City Directory for 1881 and 1882 as a licensed plumber operating on J Street, in the commercial district adjacent to the old waterfront. His business is listed under the category of plumbing and pipe fitting, which in the context of Sacramento in this period meant primarily work on the water mains and sewer connections that the raised city had installed above the old ground level, and on the access infrastructure that connected the raised street level to the original grade below. This was specialized work in Sacramento in a way that it was not elsewhere, because Sacramento's dual geography required plumbers who understood the relationship between two levels of infrastructure separated by a decade of fill and several feet of grade change, and who were willing to work in the lower level, which was dark and damp and smelled of the Sacramento River and the centuries, accumulated drainage, and was not a pleasant environment to spend a working day in. The name Ira Flood does not appear to be fabricated, which is the direct answer to the suspicion raised above. It appears in the City Directory, which is a public record. It appears in a brief item in the Sacramento Daily Record Union from March of 1882, reporting that a licensed plumber working on a utility connection in the old level passages below K Street had encountered an obstruction in a section of passage that city records indicated should have been clear, and had reported the obstruction to the city's Public Works office. The item is 6 lines long and does not elaborate. It appeared on page 4, in the column of brief local notices that newspapers of this period maintained for exactly this category of event. things that happened and were worth noting, and were not, in the estimation of the editor, worth more than 6 lines. What Flood reported to the Public Works Office, and what the Public Works Office did with the report, requires some reconstruction from sources that are not entirely consistent with each other. The city's public works records from 1882 are held at the California State Archives in Sacramento, and they are fragmentary in the way that municipal records of this period tend to be. Some categories of documentation were kept carefully, others were kept badly, and the records of specific work orders and complaints from this period have the quality of a filing system that was overwhelmed by the volume of work the raised city's ongoing construction was generating. A work order was opened in response to Flood's report. The work order describes the obstruction as a section of passage that was inaccessible due to what the work order calls a recent structural modification to the passage infrastructure. This is the language of a bureaucratic document describing something that was done, by someone with the authority to do it, to a section of the underground passage network that the city nominally maintained, but that sat adjacent to railroad-controlled property. What Flood told people other than the Public Works Office is where the account becomes more interesting and less official. He told his wife, whose letters to her sister in Stockton survive in a private family collection that a researcher encountered in the 1990s while working on a history of Sacramento's raised city infrastructure. The letters are not dramatic documents. They are the letters of a woman writing to her sister about the events of their domestic life, and the passage concerning her husband's discovery occupies 2 paragraphs in a letter otherwise concerned with the price of flour and the behavior of a neighbor's dog. What she wrote was that Ira had come home from work in a state she described as disturbed, which was unlike him, and that when she pressed him about it, he told her he had found something below K Street that was not on any city map he had access to, and that when he tried to follow the passage to understand what he was looking at, he had reached a wall that was too new to have been there long, built of brick that had not yet taken on the staining and efflorescence of older brickwork, and that behind the wall, because the wall was not fully mortared at one point, or because the mortar had not fully cured, and there was a gap, he had been able to see into the space beyond it, with his lantern held close. What he saw, as his wife rendered it in her letter to her sister in Stockton, was a passage larger than the ones the city maintained, not a utility tunnel, not the low cramped access ways that the raised city infrastructure used for water mains and sewer connections, but something taller and wider, and with a floor that had been finished in a way the utility passages were not. She wrote that he described the floor as having been laid with material, and that the material was different from the brick rubble and compacted fill that formed the floors of the city passages. He described marks on the walls that he said looked deliberate, though what kind of deliberate he could not say from the angle available to him through the gap and with a single lantern. He described a smell that he associated with the river but lower, somehow, below the river smell that pervaded all the old level passages, a smell that he said was older than the other smells, the way that some things smell old in a specific way that you recognize without being able to name. He did not report what he had seen to the Public Works Office. He reported the obstruction, which was the brick wall, without describing what the obstruction was adjacent to. He told his wife. His wife told her sister. The sister's response, which survives in the same family collection as the original letter, encouraged him to let it alone, which appears to be the advice he took. The Public Works work order for the obstruction was closed 3 weeks later, with a notation that the issue had been resolved by the responsible party, which in the language of the period's municipal records meant that whoever had built the wall had acknowledged building it, and the city had accepted that acknowledgement without requiring the wall to be removed. The responsible party is not named in the work order. The work order does not contain, in its surviving form, any documentation of who the responsible party was or what authority they had cited for modifying a section of the city's underground passage infrastructure without prior notification to the Public Works Office. The Central Pacific Railroad's operations in Sacramento in 1882 included significant subsurface work related to the expansion of its yard facilities north of the waterfront. Work that the railroad conducted under its own engineering authority and that is documented in the railroad's own records, which are now held at the Huntington Library in San Marino. The Huntington Library's Central Pacific collection is extensive and has been well studied by historians of the railroad's construction period. The subsurface operations records for Sacramento from 1881 and 1882 are not among the well-studied portions of the collection. The underground passages of Old Sacramento are a tourist attraction now. The Sacramento History Museum and several private operators run tours through sections of the old ground level, and the tours are well-designed and historically informative, covering the city's flood history, the raising process, and the lives of the people who inhabited and worked in the lower level during and after the raising period. The tours do not cover the section of passage below K Street, where flood encountered the new brick wall in the spring of 1882, because that section is not accessible on any of the tours currently operating. Whether it is not accessible because it remains sealed or because it has been incorporated into building infrastructure and lost its character as a distinct passage, or for some other reason, is not clear from the available documentation of the current tour routes. What Sacramento's underground preserves, in the sections that are accessible and the sections that are not, is a record of how a city decided to deal with its own unworkable relationship to the river and the flood, which is a problem that many cities have faced and resolved in various ways, and which Sacramento resolved by the radical measure of abandoning its original ground level and building a new city 8 feet above it while keeping the old one intact as the new city's basement. The old ground level is genuinely strange to move through. The windows of the original buildings open into what are now subgrade vaults. The doorways open into the fill. The streets of 1849 are under the streets of 1882, which are under the streets of today, and the people who walk J Street and K Street above are walking on a city that is walking on a city, and below that second city there may be, in a section of passage that a plumber found disturbing enough to come home quiet about and his wife found significant enough to write to her sister about. A passage with a finished floor, and marks on the walls that looked deliberate, and a smell below the river smell, sealed behind a brick wall built by a responsible party that the Public Works record declined to name. The Sacramento River is still flooding the valley, less catastrophically than it once did because of a system of dams and levees that has changed the river's relationship to the surrounding land, and the old ground level is still below the current one. Still dark and damp and smelling of the river, still containing what it was built to contain and what accumulated in it across the centuries of the city's life above it. The brick wall, if it is still intact, has now been there for 140 years. What is behind it has been behind it for all of that time, in the particular patience of underground things that have no reason to be anywhere else. The railroad's authority over the subsurface infrastructure of cities it passed through is a dimension of Central Pacific and Southern Pacific history that has received less scholarly attention than the railroad's influence over California's land grants, its political machine, and its labor practices. What the railroad could do to a city's physical infrastructure in this period was considerable, because the railroad's presence was itself the infrastructure on which the city's economy depended, and cities that wanted to maintain good relations with the institution that determined whether freight moved and at what price were not in strong positions to challenge its decisions about subsurface modifications to passages adjacent to its facilities. Sacramento was the Central Pacific's home city in a specific sense. Leland Stanford had been governor of California. Collis Huntington had lobbied Congress in Washington for the railroad's land grants and financing. The Big Four had built their mansions on Nob Hill in San Francisco with money the railroad generated, and the city of Sacramento had grown with and through and around the railroad's presence for 2 decades by 1882. The railroad did not need to explain itself when it built a wall and a passage near its facilities. It needed only to be the railroad, which in Sacramento in 1882 was sufficient. The Chinese workers who built the Central Pacific's portion of the transcontinental line through the Sierra Nevada had built much of old Sacramento's physical infrastructure as well, including significant portions of the raised city construction that created the underground passages in the first place. The history of Chinese labor in Sacramento in this period is the history of a community that performed the physical work of building the city while being systematically excluded from the civic life of the city they built. The Chinese quarter of Sacramento in the 1870s and 1880s occupied the lower Delta district near the waterfront, and the tunnels and passages of the raised city were, for the Chinese residents and workers who used them, a practical network of movement between parts of the city that surface routes made inconvenient or unsafe. The underground Sacramento that tourists walk through today was a working geography for specific communities at specific historical moments, not simply a flood response engineering project. Who used the passages and for what purposes has been partially recovered by historians working on Sacramento's Chinese-American history, but only partially, because the people who used the passages had the same relationship to the official documentary record that Maroon communities had to their own. They generated very little of it, by necessity and by exclusion, and what they did generate has survived imperfectly. There is a further complication to the account this piece has been building, the question of what the passage flood glimpsed through the gap in the not-yet-cured mortar actually was. The raised city construction in Sacramento produced, in its documentation, references to several passages and vaults built during the raising period for specific commercial or utility purposes, and then lost track of in subsequent decades as the city changed hands and records were consolidated or misfiled, or simply not maintained. A vault built in 1868 for a specific merchant's cold storage, sealed when the merchant's business closed and the building above changed use, would by 1882 be 14 years old. Not old enough to have the efflorescence of older brickwork, but old enough for the mortar to have cured fully, and for the space inside to have developed the compound smell of old underground, river damp, organic decay. The particular mustiness of spaces that have not been aired in a long time. A former cold storage vault with a finished floor and markings that were once a merchant's inventory system would fit Flood's description and his wife's letter without requiring anything more than the ordinary entropy of a city growing past its own recent infrastructure. This is the honest accounting that the genre demands and frequently avoids. The prosaic explanation is not only possible, but probable. And the fact that the prosaic explanation is less interesting than the alternative does not make the alternative more likely. What makes this account worth writing and reading is not the possibility that something inexplicable is behind the wall below K Street. It is the texture of how cities accumulate layers of history faster than their institutional memory can keep up with them, so that a plumber doing ordinary work in 1882 could encounter a space that was not on any map he had access to, and report it in the official register as an obstruction without describing what the obstruction bordered. And his wife could write about it to her sister in Stockton as a thing worth recording, and the sister could write back advising him to let it alone. And that small chain of private record-keeping would be all that survived of the encounter. Not because anything was suppressed, but because the city's official attention was on the raised streets and the railroad's yard expansion, and the price of flour, and a plumber who came home disturbed by something he had seen through a gap in a wall was not, in the official accounting, a significant event. The significant events are often somewhere else in the record from where they feel like they should be. The people who built Sacramento's underground are more interesting than the underground they built. And the underground they built is more interesting than whatever any individual passage might contain. And the question of who had access to the underground and who did not, and why, is more revealing than the question of what was behind Flood's wall. His wife's 2 paragraphs in a letter about flower prices and a neighbor's dog are the historical record of a working man's working day in a city that was still becoming itself in 1882, still layering its history over its history, still managing the gap between what it had been and what it was trying to be. That gap is the city. That gap is what all cities are. Sacramento is just unusually literal about it. You can descend into the gap in the sections the tours cover and stand in the street of the city that is under the street of the city that is under the street you came from, and feel, briefly, the weight of all that accumulated ordinary life pressing down from above, and understand that the city keeps going whether or not anyone is paying attention to what it keeps.